It's time for another episode of I Am Northwest Arkansas, the podcast covering the intersection of business, culture, entrepreneurship, and life in general here in the Ozarks. Whether you are considering a move to this area or trying to learn more about the place you call home, we've got something special for you. Here's our host, Randy Wilburn.
Hey folks, and welcome back to another episode of I Am Northwest Arkansas. I'm your host, Randy Wilburn, and I'm excited to be here as I always am. I'm sitting here at the KUAF Studios, 91.3 FM on your radio dial. I'm here at their location recording this podcast episode. I'm so excited to sit down with my next guest and kind of share a little bit about what he is doing here in Northwest Arkansas. And, you know, one of the things that I always say that is about this podcast, and I can't believe I'm into my 6th year now. It will actually be technically 6 years in April, but one of the things that I say is that one thing leads to another. One guest leads to another guest. And so today is no exception to that rule that I've been living by for the past almost 6 years of recording this podcast. I had a former guest on here, Damara Baker, and she had Rockin' Baker, which she ran for quite some time as an entrepreneur. And she did some amazing things with individuals on the spectrum, employing so many of them here in Northwest Arkansas. And then also on top of all of that, just making great bread. And Damara has become a dear friend. And she's somebody that I met through my buddy, Mark Zweig, who's the reason why I'm in Northwest Arkansas. If you've been a longtime listener to the podcast, you know how close that Mark and I are. But anyway, Mark introduced me to Damara, and Damara introduced me to our next guest, Peter Norman, who is he's an assistant professor of law at the University of Arkansas and the director of Community Enterprise and Development Clinic. And the short name for it is CRED, but we're going to get into all of the things that Peter's working on. But I so appreciate Damara constantly introducing me to new people. And she's like, oh, here's somebody that you should know and you should have him on your podcast. Here's somebody that you should know and you should have her on your podcast. And so today is one of those episodes that I'm having somebody on the podcast because of somebody else that I've had on the podcast in the past. So be that as it may, I'm very thankful for all the connections that this podcast has allowed me to make throughout the region of Northwest Arkansas. I'm also so very thankful for having this platform and being able to share it. And so without further ado, I want to welcome Peter Norman to the podcast. How are you doing today?
Doing really well, Randy. Thanks so much for having me on. Pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. So listen, first of all, I would love for you just to kind of give a little bit about your background. I just gave a quick little brief synopsis, but I understand what the Rural Enterprise Development Clinic does here at the University of Arkansas, but I'd love for you just to kind of share a little bit about yourself. And then why don't you talk a little bit about the work that you're doing at the clinic?
Sure, absolutely. So I just am new to Northwest Arkansas myself and have had a wonderful time discovering the community. Before this, I was a lawyer in private practice for many years. I started off at a New York-based firm called Milbank and worked in their Singapore office and actually worked in Asia for a total of about 8 years. Ended up in the renewable energy field working for an American company that did renewable energy development around the world. And then in 2015, moved back to the US, had a tech startup that I worked on, went back into law practice, and then started having some conversations with people who were in the clinical law field. And legal clinics, for those who don't know, are often associated with universities, and they offer free legal services of various sorts to people who otherwise might not have access to them, while at the same time training students to be the best possible lawyers they can be. And this was a field that really interested me. It would allow people who do it to go out and meet a lot of people who are doing really interesting work, to benefit those who need help navigating the justice system, and also to be able to reflect on what you're doing, to be able to be involved with a community of people who are thinking about these things and are trying to make them better. So I was at the University of Baltimore for a couple of years, working on a clinic there with a wonderful professor named Jamie Lee, and then was just hired by Arkansas to start a new clinic that was the continuation of a previous clinic, but sort of transformed to serve small businesses, nonprofits, cooperatives, small municipal governments, and other organizations like that.
So, wow, I mean, that's a lot. First of all, I'm glad you're here. Okay, that's number one. You've been all over. I mean, Singapore, back to the States. What was it like as an attorney getting into a tech startup? Because I know a lot of times when people think what the natural arc of a professional career of an attorney would be just to, like, I have family members that are attorneys and they've all tried to work at prestigious law firms, and there is a typical arc that you see, but you seem to have taken a different route.
Yeah, and it's one that I think is really valuable in being able to help and work with our clients too, because the mindset you get as an attorney often is, it makes us great at cocktail parties because we're trained to spot risks. So we're always seeing the negative side of stuff. We're always, especially business attorneys like me who are helping people draft contracts and create relationships and those sorts of things. A big part of the value we add is to think about what could possibly go wrong. Now, when you're an entrepreneur, it's the exact opposite. You have to look for those opportunities to do things that might go right and be willing to take a little bit of risk. I mean, you have to go out there and sort of credibly pitch your case. So it was a big mindset shift on my part, but I think something that's really valuable. You also learn to respect people who have a fairly wide variety of abilities and personalities and talents. So, for example, I was new to sales, but when I started in entrepreneurship, I had to go out and do the sales myself. And I learned this, it's a skilled and hard position to be able to go in somewhere, talk to someone who might be skeptical about who you are and what you're offering, and really convince them of the value of what you're doing. So it was a really valuable experience. And then going back into law, I think it stayed with me a bit in that respect.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, I've always told people the one thing, I've always been a consummate salesperson. It is something I learned to do early on. And I tell people, and as I've told my sons, it's probably one of the most invaluable tools that you can have in your tool belt that will literally serve you your whole life.
Absolutely. And there are some lessons that I think are widely applicable that I learned while doing it. One is qualify your leads. So be upfront with people about who you are and what you have to offer. And, let people say, well, that's not for me in some respects. And, you find the zone of people who, are in line with what you need to offer. And then that's what you focus on. And I think that's something that's a good lesson in life in general.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the whole, when you think about, so in Baltimore, were you also serving the needs of those in the rural community, or was that more something that happened once you came here?
Actually, yes. In some respects, so the University of Baltimore, Maryland is sort of like Arkansas in the sense that there are 2 law schools in this entire state that serve, basically the entire state. So many of our clients, the University of Baltimore, as you might imagine, is in Baltimore City, but we did serve clients from around the state, including those who were involved in various sorts of farming ventures, both in rural parts of Maryland and urban farming in Baltimore City. So there was some element of that, and it tied in with, I have a background in renewable energy and sustainability, and those sorts of issues also tied in with rural development too. So did a bit of that there, but obviously coming here to Arkansas, there's a lot of new opportunities here. The law school, for starters, has a wonderful agricultural law program. My colleagues there are doing fantastic work. But also, there's a mandate at this school to serve the entire state. Yeah. That includes areas in Northwest Arkansas. There's still a lot of unmet legal need. But you talk about areas like the Delta and other parts of the state, there's tremendous need for people to go out and serve the legal needs of those communities in a variety of ways. And there are a number of our students actually who are from those parts of the state and are interested in going back. So being able to both work with communities around the state and be able to train students to take on roles in communities around the state are 2 things that we focused on as priorities for our clinic.
So, and especially for a clinic like this, one of the biggest challenges that you have is awareness, right?
Absolutely.
And I think, outside of doing a podcast like this, what are you guys doing to create awareness that people in the Delta would know, oh, this clinic is available to me to help me with some of my small business needs?
It's a great question. And I think there's no substitute for the time of trying to create relationships. So I was very fortunate because I'm starting this clinic pretty much new. I spent the last few months talking to a bunch of people and trying to reach out. And you mentioned, of course, Demara and meeting connections through connections. That's very much been my life for the last few months. So I've been fortunate to meet people who know people and have gotten connected with a couple of wonderful organizations in the Delta who are going to be among our initial cohort of clients.
Yeah.
But it's an ongoing process. And especially when you're coming in and establishing these relationships from the beginning and offering services that previously weren't there, you need to build trust with people. And that's a process that necessarily takes a while. So we're very much at the beginning of the stage. And if any of your listeners have ideas or folks that they think it would be valuable for me to talk to, folks who might be interested in building a nonprofit or a small business, folks that are in smaller communities where the city governments might want advice about taking advantage of, for example, federal funding for renewable energy, just to give one example. Those are all folks I would love to have conversations with.
Yeah, well, no, definitely. And we'll be sharing this out both near and far, and hopefully this episode or a segment from this episode will get aired on Ozarks at Large. But I think it's important to ask and be able to clarify, what is the scope of services that you are offering currently
Absolutely.
And hope to offer in the near future?
Absolutely. So I want to stress both the geographical scope that we work on and the types of scope that we offer. So we just talked about the fact that the clinic is, working with clients around the state. We are also working very much with clients in Northwest Arkansas in particular. And I've been in touch with a lot of this wonderful ecosystem of entrepreneurship organizations here, ASB, TDC.
Yeah. That name always gets me. It's a mouthful, but I have it down. And ASB TDC does some great work in the whole state.
Yes.
Both down in central Arkansas and beyond, but also right here in our backyard in Northwest Arkansas.
Absolutely. And the variety of other organizations. There's the Brewer Family Entrepreneurship Hub, which is right up the street from the KUAF studios. There's Startup Junkie. There's Entrepreneurship for All, which I believe is based out of Rogers.
Yep.
A lot of different.
Yeah.
There's a lot of organizations that are doing great work. And they obviously are part of our constituency too. Folks that are bring to our attention possible legal needs for us to serve. And there's also the community of people on campus. And there are students, undergrads and grad students who are interested in starting businesses. And that's also a constituency for us.
Yeah.
So what do we do for them? Well, I should mention, first of all, that the law clinics at the law school at the University of Arkansas, there are 4 different legal clinics that each of them serve different needs. So there's an immigration law clinic.
Mm-hmm.
There's a criminal defense clinic. There's a civil advocacy clinic that does things like, say your boss hasn't paid you for work you've done. They might be able to help you with something like that. And my clinic is what we call a transactional law clinic, which means we don't go to court and we mostly help organizations. So say for a small business, you might be trying to decide, should I form a corporation or an LLC? We can help you make that decision and we can help you draft the documents to file for those.
Yeah.
You might be trying to decide, well, I'm going into business with a few friends. How do we manage things? How do we organize the business so we can make decisions together? Thinking through the bylaws or the operating agreement that sort of is the roadmap for how we make decisions amongst ourselves. You might be entering into commercial lease and you might want to know, am I getting a good deal on this? We can help you with the legal side of that, figuring out what provisions should be in the lease, those sorts of things. If you're, say, starting up as a vendor and you want to have a contract that you can share with potential customers, we can help you draft those contracts and a variety of other things such as the beginning. So that's for small businesses. There are a lot of people in Northwest Arkansas who are also interested in forming other sorts of organizations, say nonprofits. And the process for getting tax exempt status can be, somewhat tricky. So we help organizations with that.
What about B Corps?
And B Corps is a great question. So this is something that I found both in Baltimore and here has been a recent trend. There used to be a big divide between people who wanted to have sort of a private for-profit business on one hand and people who wanted to, say, form a charity on the other. And they were worlds apart. But now what we're seeing is a lot of people who have an interest in doing some combination of the two, and meaning that they want to perhaps earn some money through the ventures they're in. They want to, say, sell some products. They're not necessarily giving away things for free or they have some blend of commerce in their operations, but they also want to serve a social purpose of some sort.
Yeah.
And B Corps are one tool for doing this. I should mention, so Arkansas, like many states, has what's called a benefit corporation law, and it allows you to form a for-profit company that is, for most purposes, like any other for-profit company, taxed the same. I don't think you get any special benefits from the government necessarily for being one, but it basically announces to the world that you have constituents, you have stakeholders, aside from the traditional shareholders that you're trying to maximize value for. And those can include your community. It can include the environment. It can include your workers. And that you are saying that in making your decisions for your company, you're taking into account the needs and the interests of those additional stakeholders. So that's one tool if someone wants to form a social enterprise to think about. Maybe I want to form a B Corp. And for example, I know that you are a fan of Ozark Natural Foods. They're a cooperative.
Right.
And cooperatives are another tool for doing something similar to, have a business that, sells food, for example, but is structured in such a way that, say, the people who are buying the food and its members are sort of part of the operations and part of the governance.
Right.
There are also people who are interested in worker cooperatives. And this is a great option, for example, for family-owned businesses where the first generation is retiring and there have been workers who have been with them for a long period of time. And the workers want to sort of take over the business and run it themselves. So that's something that people have been interested in too.
Yeah.
So a lot of the most interesting work we do is in this intersection. People who are interested in both sort of doing something good for the world, but also interested in participating in sort of the economy, I guess you could say.
Yeah. And I think about, I guess, like lately in the news, we've been hearing a lot about OpenAI and their move from nonprofit status to for-profit status. And I think they're even electing to try to be a B Corp, if I'm not mistaken. And again, I don't really know because I don't, I just kind of follow some of the news. And I know that there are some challenges because a lot of people are like, well, you guys started out as a nonprofit. Now you want to be for-profit. And that those elections can create some problems, especially with the type of business that OpenAI is. Given the fact that most of the people listening to this are not running that type of business,
right? I
think it is important to understand and know what the law says. And that's why, what Peter is sharing is really important. And that's why knowledge is power, especially when it comes to setting up your books and setting up the type of business that you're going to run. Because I actually get that question quite a bit from people. And I've had several corporations. I've had a few S Corps. My current business structure is I started it as an LLC and then elected S corporation status, and which is really what allows it to be, for me and my tax purposes, a pass-through entity so that I don't get taxed twice. If I was a traditional C Corp, then I would have taxation at the corporation level as well as at the individual level. And so, and again, I don't pretend to be a tax lawyer in any way, shape, or form, but those are some of the questions that a lot of people have. And I get questions from people all the time about what should I do? Should I set myself up? And I tell people, like, just starting out in business, I'm like, you know what? Just get a business license. And then in some cities, you don't even need a business license to run a sole proprietorship. Some cities do require it. So know what your city law is around that. But if they don't require it, just hang your shingle out and do something in your name until you figure out whether or not you have a viable product or service to market to the world, right? Because the world's going to tell you pretty quickly whether or not what you're selling them is people are interested in it.
Absolutely. And you made two really important points that I spend a decent amount of time thinking about. The first is the fact that there are a variety of ways, if you're interested in, say, starting a business or an enterprise. We use the word enterprise because it's pretty general. We have people who want to do various sorts of ventures in the broad sense of the world. There are a variety of ways of doing that, and you touched on a few. So you have the choice of what kind of legal entity you want to form. You could form an LLC or a corporation, or, benefit corporation is a type of corporation. And then there's the tax layer on top of that. So depending on which of those you pick, you might have some options. If you have an LLC, you can elect for different types of tax treatment, including S Corp treatment, C Corp treatment, or partnership taxation treatment. And which of those you want to do very much depends on your plans for the future, what kind of funds you plan to raise. So for example, if you're out there, you want to attract venture capital, there are certain structures that might be better for you. If you think that you're going to be funding yourself out of friends and family and you don't need much external money, there might be different options that are more attractive to you. So all of those things are things that our clinic can help with. And when you get more into the detailed tax advice, obviously that's something where getting a good tax accountant is very important. So we'll help you run through the different options and understand how all these things interact. When it comes to running the numbers, that's when a good tax accountant can be really valuable too.
Yeah. And, and I also want to highlight for those listening to this, because a lot of times when we think of we hear the words or the word rural, we think farms, right? We think instantly farms or some place that's way out west of town or east of town. When I say town, because we're recording this in Fayetteville, we're kind of like in the city center, in the center part of the region of Northwest Arkansas. But all you have to do is go 10 miles out in any direction and you're just like in farmland, like really bucolic settings that are really nice. But I think it's important for people to understand that just because it says rural doesn't mean it doesn't include businesses that are right here in the artery of Northwest Arkansas, which would be everything from Bella Vista down to Fayetteville and everything in between.
Absolutely. And a great example of that is I was talking to some folks at the Brewer Family Entrepreneurship Hub just yesterday. And one of the areas that they see a lot of activity in is outdoor recreation. So there are a lot of startups that are trying to get into the outdoor recreation space in Arkansas.
And that's why GORP came about.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a great example of something where, the company might be based in Fayetteville, but it might operate on the Buffalo River. Or it might be based in a rural area, and it might be folks there trying to start a new sort of economic engine for their community, trying to figure out how to break into a new field and attract people in that sort of way. So there's a lot happening in rural areas, and a lot of people don't realize exactly how diverse the interests and populations and needs and communities in rural areas are. So that's something that we're very interested in exploring and getting to know folks and what they're really looking for there too. And how much there's an interaction between, people who are living in Fayetteville, but are, have roots in, say, Mountain Home, or people who are interested in starting a business that might be involved with rural areas and might be involved with organic farming or might be involved with conservation. And we see a lot of different activities out there.
Yeah, I think what you guys are doing is really important. And I think it is the biggest takeaway that I would like people to get from this particular episode, is just to create some knowledge and awareness around your organization. But I also think it's important to know that there are a lot of options out there. And one of the things that I've said to anyone that will listen is that Northwest Arkansas has significant resources for the startup community.
Yep.
Whatever that might be, right? You might be making cookies in your kitchen. You might be making shea butter lotion in your bathroom or whatever. There are options and opportunities available to steward you along the path of building your business. And I think that's the point that I really want the listeners to recognize, is that they're not alone, that there are significant options and programs. And you mentioned several of them. ASB TDC puts on programs every month on how you run your business. They might one month, they may do a program on financing. Another month, they might do a program on marketing and advertising and communication, and the list goes on and on. The E4All does the same. Startup Junkie does the same. So there are Forge. There are so many different programs out there that make this type of information available. I know that you guys have been, you're still new, right? But the model of what you're doing is not new. Do you have any success stories that you can share that you've been able to amass early on in this process, or is it still too new for you guys to point to something and say, we helped this organization do X?
Well, we're taking on our first cohort of clients just now. In fact, I gave my students their client assignments yesterday evening.
Oh, nice.
We're really excited about the group of clients that we're starting off with. It includes folks doing all sorts of really interesting things. I mentioned organic farming and conservation before. There are folks working with immigrant and refugee communities that we're working with. There are religious groups that we're helping with their service work, which comes out of their faith. There are community recreation centers in the area that we're helping to get off the ground. So here in Arkansas, we're right now emerging and taking our first clients on board to try to work with them to accomplish their goals and try to understand what their vision is and how we can both assist them and make sure the law isn't a bottleneck in achieving that. Going back to something you said earlier, there are a lot of different entrepreneurship support organizations in Northwest Arkansas. The legal services side of it can sometimes be a bit of a bottleneck. And one of the things that we're trying to do is both figure out how to help clients who have uniquely complicated situations, which is one of the best fits for us. So we have a model where each of our students gets one client per semester, and they work with that client all semester. So you mentioned earlier OpenAI. This is a great example of a company organization that's sort of spanning the nonprofit, tax exempt, but obviously also deeply involved with this like incredibly lucrative industry type model. And I mentioned before that a lot of companies, and maybe OpenAI isn't the direction everyone wants to go in, but a lot of companies want some combination of the two, want a social mission or a nonprofit mission, and want also to participate in commerce. That tends to be more complicated. The law around that tends to be trickier. There's a doctrine in nonprofit tax-exempt law called the commerciality doctrine that the IRS tends to be a bit skeptical of nonprofits that want to compete with existing for-profits. So if you want to do something like this, that requires a lot of legal thinking and a lot of sort of bespoke work, I guess you could say. On the other hand, there's a lot of legal need from folks who just want to form an LLC, say, who have talked to ASB, TDC, have gone through, talked to E4All, know what their business model is, but need help sort of like getting that work done. And the role we see for our clinic is sort of twofold. On one hand, we want the educational purpose we have for our students is in some ways best served by those sort of more difficult cases. But on the other hand, we also have a role to serve the community very broadly. So we're trying to figure out and work with our partner organizations to figure out how to maximize our impact. And that can come in a variety of different ways. There are already organizations that produce some great quality, sort of free legal information out there. ASB, TDC, for example, has a video set. You can go on their website and look at that. The Brewer Family Entrepreneurship Hub is also developing a set of online resources. Legal Aid of Arkansas has its own set of online resources.
Yeah.
So we're hoping to build and expand those. We're hoping to figure out models that will allow us to reach a lot of people where possible, while also serving our students and giving them a rich educational experience and serving clients whose needs are not met by something necessarily quite so off the shelf. So that's really where we're at and the variety of different folks that we're trying to serve.
Yeah, because as I'm sitting here listening to what you're sharing, if somebody comes to you like in the middle of your semester, right? Because semester just started as we're recording this. But if somebody came to you with a legal question or something along those lines, can you still help them out? Or is it the kind of thing where it's like, well, next semester we can, hopefully move you into the rotation and help you out? Or is there an ad hoc way of dealing with certain legal matters or legal questions that come up that you just run across all the time and that it's easier to help people with?
That's a great question. So we take in new clients twice a year for each semester. So we accept applications throughout the year. And the usual process, just to give you and your listeners a sense, is someone is connected with us one way or the other. And people approach us through our partner organizations who we've been in touch with. People find us on the university website or otherwise, come across our information. And I have a conversation with them. I want to understand what their legal needs are, what their goals are. And if it's something that we can serve them on, I send them an application. There are certain areas that we don't work on. So for example, we don't do bankruptcy.
Okay.
So after this initial conversation, I'll be able to determine whether this is something we can help with and send them an application. We do say that, we only take on new clients twice a year. So if you submit your application, we would consider it for the next semester. So our spring semester, for now, this is being, recorded in January, is just beginning. So we're accepting applications, but we wouldn't be able to start services until late August, early September.
So applications are always open. It's just a matter of where people fall into it. And then once an application comes in, do you have an idea whether or not it's, that's something that we can do? Or if not, then you refer them out to somebody else that might be able to help them?
That's the other half. And another appeal I'd make to your listeners is for the lawyers out there, people in business law often have a hard time finding really interesting pro bono projects. And all lawyers, have an ethical obligation to devote some of their time and resources to pro bono work. And we find that as I've been building out my network, there are a lot of lawyers who are really interested in doing this work, but don't know how to find projects. So if you're a lawyer in any field, but have some background in business law or in working with nonprofits, we would love to hear from you because
we actually have a number of attorneys that listen to this podcast. So,
excellent.
So, guys, I hope you're listening. Don't let me down. Please reach out to Peter and say, hey, I heard about it on the I Am Northwest Arkansas podcast, and I wish to lend my legal expertise in a pro bono format.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I'm not so new to the podcast game that I can't say, and correct me if I'm wrong, info in the show notes.
Right. All the info will be in the show notes. And I'll certainly make sure that I get all of the contact information for Peter and and for the organization, so that way everybody that's listening to this can get some information and understanding. Now, you guys already have a website stood up now?
That's right. So the clinic program at the university already has a website, and the information for my clinic is on there now.
Okay.
So you can directly contact us that way.
Okay. What's the website address? Do you know it offhand?
It's law.uark.edu/ and from there,
it's CRED, something along those lines, right?
Yeah. From there, info in the show notes.
Right. Yeah. I'll put that in the show notes. So anybody listening to this that wants to know the link to Peter's group, we'll make sure that we put that in the show notes so that you can connect with him.
Absolutely. And I will give out my email address too, and that you can always contact me.
Yeah. What's your email address?
It's pnorman, so PNORMAN @uark.edu.
Okay.
And, feel free to shoot me an email directly. It's also a great way to get in touch with me.
Yeah.
So circling back, you were asking, so if a client comes to us and they need something fairly urgently and, the semester is still a long way off and we're not certain whether we'd be able to help them, that's when we try to reach out through this network, this referral network. And we try to find resources for people, even if we're not able to take on their matter. And that is very much a work in progress. And we're also trying to build self-help resources. So, even if we can't immediately take on your matter, there might be things that you can do yourself. After educating yourself a bit, you might be able to take some steps that take care of some of the time restrictive things. I should mention also, I should give a plug to a couple of my colleagues who run the Entrepreneurship Law Project. They hold drop-in sessions at the library here in Fayetteville. I believe they'll be starting up every other week.
Okay.
So there's the possibility of getting quick legal advice on certain matters through their sessions too.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard about that before, and I will make sure we get a link for that as well, and that's during the school year, right? Those drop-in sessions.
That's right. I believe so. And they, I believe, also sort of take the show on the road and host drop-in sessions in different places around the state, I think outside of this semester. So, their calendar is available too. And that's a great resource too, especially if you have just a question that you need help with. That's a great way to get a lawyer to talk to on it.
Yeah. So, it sounds like some of the biggest challenges that you guys are going to try to overcome is, again, the awareness factor, making sure that people know that there are resources available to them to answer some of these questions. Because I think sometimes, and I know this because I've dealt with other matters from a rural perspective. So housing is one, food insecurity is another. But then you have, legal matters as it pertains to businesses, both, here in the city, and I'm calling Fayetteville the city, but also out in the rural areas of Northwest Arkansas and beyond. And so what are you most excited about accomplishing through this organization that you feel will really serve the needs of rural small businesses that are in the state?
So when I think about, and this again is having been in Northwest Arkansas since just over the summer, my impressions are still growing and developing. But my initial impression is that one of the big differences between Northwest Arkansas, what you could call metropolitan Northwest Arkansas, and rural areas is while there aren't enough legal resources for small businesses in Northwest Arkansas, and while we're trying to think of all these ways of extending our reach because there's a real unmet need for legal resources, there's an entrepreneurship community here. There's a small business community. There's a nonprofit community. There are communities for immigrant groups in Northwest Arkansas that are organized and are channels for people who are interested in starting a business. And then the legal services might be seen as a little bit of there's a lack of legal services that need to be overcome. But then we have a lot of people who come to us because they've been primed to start a business. They know that's out there. In other parts of the state where they don't have that infrastructure, it might be that people don't even think this is something that's possible for them.
Right.
So, it's something where, you search for your keys where the streetlight is. Like you look what possibilities are available based on what resources you have around it there. So, developing this network over time of letting people in other underserved parts of the state know that these are possibilities for you and that there are resources available, I think is going to be a long and continuing process, but it's something we're excited to begin. Yeah,
well, and I'm excited for you, and I'm certainly rooting for this organization and the work that you're going to put in. And certainly, I wish we will continue to stay in contact so that we can learn as you guys grow and evolve. And, you have some stories to share about ways that you've made a difference in the lives of Arkansans, right? In terms of those that want to start a business and just need some legal hand-holding, legal advice, legal wrangling. It just depends, right? And so, I mean, you are, I always tell people, there's an expert out there in everything. You just need to know what expert you need, right? We all need an expert in something. And so whether it's legal advice, somebody with a strong business acumen for startups work, somebody that can help you communicate more effectively, somebody that can help you market better. There are experts out there in all those areas. And certainly in the area of growing a business, starting a business organization and business development, the legal structure of those businesses can certainly set you up for a strong success. It's like a foundation, if Absolutely. You will. So I really want to encourage people to not say, oh, well, I'll get to that at some point in time. It's something that you should at least make yourself aware of, right? I mean, you could do a lot worse than just at least doing some research on Dr. Google or going to this building behind me, which is the Fayetteville Public Library, or any public library for that matter, to get these resources that are available to you. And then certainly reaching out to Peter Norman's group and learning more about how they could potentially serve some of your needs. And so we want to encourage people to get, in all you can, get the understanding and knowledge that you need to be successful in whatever you're endeavoring to do, especially if you're trying to start a business.
Absolutely. And I should stress, sometimes lawyers, including in the business context, are seen as sort of the gatekeepers, the people who say no. The approach that we try to instill in our students is a client-centered approach.
Yeah.
Our focus is on understanding very deeply your goals, understanding what it is you really want to accomplish. No one sort of wants an LLC for its own sake, or very few people do. Maybe you decide to check off, that's on your bucket list, you want to check it off. But for most people, these legal maneuvers are means to an end.
Yeah.
And what a good lawyer can do, and what we're trying to teach our students to do, is to dig deeply into what it is you want, and then use the law and identify non-legal opportunities where available to meet those needs. So the lawyer you work with should be sort of your partner in this and thinking through these sorts of issues. And if you're someone who's perhaps been putting off going to a lawyer because you think it is something where, someone's just going to throw a lot of jargon at you and, say no to you and your ideas, that's not what we're here for. We're here to listen to you and to understand what it is you want and see how you can get there.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Peter Norman, assistant professor of law at the University of Arkansas and director of community enterprise and development clinic at the University of Arkansas, we want to thank you for coming on the podcast. I would be remiss if I didn't ask you a couple of questions. One of the things that we're trying to do new here on the podcast is ask some interesting questions that might be enlightening to the listener and also give us an even deeper depth glimpse of the individual that we had on the podcast. So because you're new to the area, I would love for you to kind of just share a piece of advice that you'd give to someone considering moving to Northwest Arkansas for the first time.
Yeah, I'd say, and this is going to be somewhat Fayetteville centric, so apologies to my friends in Springdale and Rogers and Bentonville and all the other towns in the region. But I've found that getting involved with the Fayetteville community here has been one of the most enriching things. So we're fortunate to live pretty close in town here and are able to, go to the farmer's market, go to Ozark Natural Foods. We went to sort of the opening of the Upper Bramble just the other week, and or is it the Lower Bramble?
Lower Bramble.
Lower Bramble.
It's fine.
Just the other week, and you start seeing the same faces again. You and people here are friendly, and they're willing to engage you, and they're willing to sort of get to know your story and sort of help you out. And that's been one of the wonderful things about living here. So get out there and meet people, I think, is the advice I'd give.
And then, okay, my last question for you is what has become your go-to comfort food spot in Northwest Arkansas?
Great. I have an answer to this already, although I also invite listeners to email me your suggestions. But my wife and my comfort food place is Formosa on College Ave.
Okay.
Both of us have spent time in Asia, and the traditional Chinese menu at Formosa is quite good. I recommend it to folks.
Oh, so, good. That's the first. Okay, that's awesome. Formosa, I know Formosa. I've actually never been there, but I need to go check it out now that you say that. And since you spent time in Asia, I'll say that your street cred's probably legit. So yeah, I appreciate that. Well, listen, we really appreciate it. Again, give that email address for those that were listening, your email.
Absolutely. It's pnorman, PNORMAN @uark.edu.
Okay, perfect. And we'll make sure that all of this information is in the show notes. And I'll have Professor Norman fill out a form and once he fills that out, we'll include all that great information and detail that he shared on today's episode in the show notes. So please go to the show notes. You can head over to IamNorthwestArkansas.com and just search for this episode with Peter Norman. And I think you'll be really pleased with the information that you find. So again, we really appreciate it. But Professor Norman, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. Well, there you have it, folks. Another episode of the I Am Northwest Arkansas podcast. To learn more about us, you can visit us online at IamNorthwestArkansas.com. Remember, you can tune into our podcast on all of the major podcasting platforms, especially Apple Podcasts, where we would love for you to consider giving us a rating and a review. We love reviews. We love to learn how we're doing, and we'd love to hear from you. But I just want to encourage you that, there's so many great things happening here in Northwest Arkansas. We're trying to highlight each and every one of them as quickly as we can. And certainly with one episode a week, we only have but so much time in the day. So please continue to spread this knowledge and information that we're putting out there. And remember, knowledge is power and sharing is certainly special. So we really appreciate each and every one of you. And we'll see you back here next week with another new episode of the I Am Northwest Arkansas podcast. Peace.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of I Am Northwest Arkansas. Check us out each and every week, available anywhere that great podcasts can be found. For show notes or more information on becoming a guest, visit IamNorthwestArkansas.com. We'll see you next week on I Am Northwest Arkansas.